So normally at this time, we have our open conversation. Any questions or things you'd like to discuss openly, partially or completely? And we can continue if you have any other questions about what we were talking about. We can cover that too.
While you were talking earlier, I was wondering how much news the retreatants get while they are on retreat, and do they know what happened in November of 2016?
Well, what's that?
I just think that would be like a nice Groundhog's Day to never come out of that. It would be wonderful. But
they all think it's Hillary.
At least 2 people on the retreat have, like, just to use the phrase, religiously avoided any of it. The rest of them, I'm not so sure. I think some people did. It's like, you get letters. They get letters. They can send letters. And it's, they're not supposed to send very many, but they almost probably send more than they should. So it's hard to know. I don't think any of them would admit that they had sent as many letters as they might have sent or inquired about something. But of course, at the very beginning of the retreat, they get the speech, which is, you will never again in your entire life have the opportunity to not hear any news about politics or the economy or any. You will never again have the opportunity. So if you want to throw it away, throw it away. But it's an opportunity to bring your practice and your experience entirely into a context which is not any of those things that we normally hear about and read about every day. And some people, I think, occasionally do that pretty much completely, and maybe the rest of them do their best to avoid it. They're what?
It's like an opportunity to let go of like all of the worldly.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, even just to let go of the news is a pretty big deal. When I came out of retreat, I remember I had no idea who the president was, or what, or anything that had happened. So many other things I knew, but political stuff, I had managed to put that completely aside. So it's kind of a thrill, let's say, to actually come out of a long retreat and realize you have no idea. Has there been another world war? Or what? It's like you're in a time capsule in that way. I think that's the best case. If everyone could be, that would be really quite good. But in order to do that, we'd have to be pretty more authoritarian than we would want to be.
One thing that happened for us was that the way we got the news was prayer requests. So we would get these prayer requests, like pray for so-and-so who died, pray for the people in the tsunami, but it wouldn't say where or, Yeah, the 100,000 killed in the tsunami, which was really good practice because you just had to let go of all that other part, hope it wasn't Seattle, But, so we would know some things from those prayer requests, but I think most people really want to, you go in there because you want to let go of all that, so I don't know how you guys were. You had a different time.
I don't remember getting any kind of news, except for one thing, which was Lama Tara. We were up on Salt Spring Island, and Lama Tara thought that since it was really kind of earth-shaking, we should know that Princess Diana had died in the car crash. And I just remember, no, this is your thing. This is your thing. Yeah, I just like didn't really. It didn't. I was smart enough not to push it that far. But the one thing that I do remember on this score was that while we were on retreat, O.J. Simpson was on trial, and there had been this thing going on and on and on, and we went on retreat. I've forgotten how many months in. It was like half a year in, and I was scheduled to go and travel with my mother to a family function, and so I went out. And I got on the ferry from Salt Spring Island and just a passenger and just walking up the steps. And up the top of the steps, right in front was where the newspapers were. And so I just kind of watching, I go up like this, and the headline is O.J. something. And that kind of put the nail in it for me, thinking that I needed to keep up on things, because 6 months, this is just like, no. It could have been the same newspaper from 6 months before. And there's a certain way in which being able to just take some space from that it's remarkable. Being able to just part the waters in your life for any extended period of time is a pretty remarkable thing to do. The thing that happened for me after about 4 or 5 months was realizing that all the things that I usually attributed to circumstances in my life, that I was reacting to those circumstances. This happened, so I'm feeling like this. I saw that my mind still kept on cascading in just exactly the same patterns, except I had no excuses anymore. That was really worth the price of admission right there. So there's the piece of long retreat where we part the waters and we can have some of those experiences, and then on top of that we have a number of skillful activities to engage in, meditation practices and such, and contemplations that actually kind of take advantage of parting the waters, and then take advantage of this opportunity to then meet this person who's still going through all these same things, and meet that person in a more skillful way. So that's, I highly recommend extended retreat, just for that one piece of it. One thing I mentioned this morning about extended retreat is that it takes time. There's momentum, a great deal of momentum created on retreat with the practices and just what's possible to happen, and that produces certain kinds of transformations, and those will continue if the space is there for a long time. You could say for lifetime after lifetime, but certainly it's very noticeable in the first year after retreat that things just continue to open up. You think, oh, well, I'm not engaged in the same intense schedule of meditation, but things are still opening up, as in response to the momentum created. And so that's one of the reasons to allow people space as they come out, and not try to kind of get them pinned down. And it's a great generosity to allow that.
with this idea of normalizing as they come out, I realized I have like a natural excitement to see them, but it would be like somebody I've heard of a missing cousin, but I never met them. And so I was realizing this afternoon as I'm went home and Bruce asked me what Lama Michael was talking about, and so we watched the whole hour and a half of again, and I got to hear more, and because there was a lot in it, but I realized I could overreact. I might overreact with the normalizing by, say a sister just had triplets, but kind of ignoring that because trying to normalize things, and that's so it's what's trying to find the balance of my exuberance of seeing them, my interest, curiosity, and yet not wanting to make them uncomfortable. And so how does that play out? And
what does that mean? How does it play out?
Well, in a way, if I was being normal or naturalized, it would be acknowledging out loud to someone what was going on, such as the puzzle of like that they're special and it's ordinary, and that everyone else in the Sangha is special and ordinary. And it's like, that's kind of a puzzle. How do those two disparate elements go together? And yet they do, daily. So, in my mind, the idea of playing how to normalize or naturalize would be, if I'm aware of that conundrum, say so. And I wonder, well, what's appropriate, what's not? But I often wonder that.
Yeah, we've noticed.
But what is helping is just even hearing our teachers here tonight tell aspects of what it was like to be on retreat or to come out of retreat, because I'm clueless what it means. And so having even just little details, such as Bill alluded to, getting up extra early, or so that was new to me. I'm clueless about what a long retreat is, and that helps to fill in some of my questions that I might otherwise blurt out and say, So
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
The normalized thing is actually, it's sort of automatic, of course. It will happen that your sense of people who were on retreat, after you see them for a few days, you'll stop asking the question. They're just, well, like everybody else. And so the difference is mostly our projection on it. And of course, from the standpoint of a retreatant, there's a sense of discomfort that arises by virtue of knowing that people are projecting this thing onto you. That's not comfortable. But it happens all the time. This is not unique on that score. So I think in a way, the normalization thing, we tend to make a little too much of it. It will happen on its own, and in some sense, the trick is to get out of the way so that it can just take its normal course. We don't want to give them an uncomfortable sense of being special when they're actually already maybe a little bit too conscious of the fact that people are thinking of them as special. That's not a good feeling, after a long retreat. It might be a good feeling if you're giving a book report in high school, if everybody applauds you and gives you accolades and all. But think about that situation if people continued to do that day after day, week after week. There's a certain point at which it kind of makes you feel sick. You know, so it's
Especially if you know they haven't read your book report.
right. And in the middle of the whole thing, you looked through a few pages and you saw the teacher had given you a D. And so it's like, the normalization is the best piece is that it actually doesn't stick, the specialness. It won't stick. And in a way, it's appropriate for it to be special. On day one, the gates open, they come out, of course. Everybody wants it to be special. It's special because everybody wants it to be special. And 2 days later, it's not so special anymore. And 2 months later, you forget what was special about it. And I think that's appropriate. It's not because we're a community of people who are practicing the Dharma, and the more mature approach to that is that somebody who just came in the door today is as important and as precious and as important to us as someone who's been here for 10 years. And the more that we normalize that, the quicker that the person who's new comes in will have the sense of comfort and begin to feel a sense of connection with other people, which is, in fact, of course, what keeps us here. When those things don't work, we want to go somewhere else.
One thing I'll notice in your question, there's some piece of the puzzle. A puzzle has a solution. That's one of the things that we would say about a puzzle. And if we get a jigsaw puzzle and it doesn't have all the pieces, we're very dissatisfied with it. But this is, in fact, a puzzle without all the pieces. So there isn't this completely right way to put it together. So maybe just relaxing a little bit with and as you say, you have to acknowledge your own style and kind of, okay, that's my style of approaching things, and relax a little bit.
But there was another aspect, and that was that each of us, or as Lama Michael was saying, breathing is special.
What's special?
Breathing in and out.
Especially, yeah, when you can't get your breath.
Yeah, but there is something about coming here where it hasn't worn off from the day of the blessing with Khenpo Rinpoche last summer, which is, whoa, we get to be here. You know, and it's that same fresh excitement that, like next Tuesday, it's like, it will be 26 or 27 years married with Bruce. But each day, numerous times each day, we're kind of looking at each other, and it's like, wow, we're lucky to have met each other, to be living together. And so it's like ordinary old marrieds, and yet it's still fresh and special. So this normalizing and kind of playing down the specialness, it's kind of, what's the matter with the normal being special?
What's the matter with what?
The normal being special, and recognizing that it's special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Thank you very much. Imagine if we all were on a long retreat together, and every morning we got up early in the morning at 4 o'clock or whatever, and we came together and we practiced for 2 or 3 hours, And then we went to our rooms and we practiced for another 2 or 3 hours, and then we had lunch, and then we went to our rooms and practiced for 2 or 3 hours. And we just did that day after day. And everybody knew that that's what everybody was doing, and occasionally you had some conversations about it and all. That's totally normalized. And yet, it's also totally precious. So I think many of the things we do are very precious, and it's worth noting that the excitement piece sometimes has been removed, which is a relief. It's just what we do. We practice together, we work on our bodhicitta, we work on our understanding of the Dharma. We get somebody like Khenpo Rinpoche coming, we work to make it all work and come together, and the pieces come together. And it works and it happens. And it's worth rejoicing in that thing which we have done before and doing again, and it has a normal aspect to it which is really helpful. And the special is embedded in that normal.
So I think I maybe asked this question almost a year ago, and it's still here for me.
Yeah, we remember that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Special to me, maybe not to you. But
you could remind us, maybe.
So precious human birth. You know, so the fact that we're human and we have these faculties about us that we can listen and understand the Dharma to various degrees. You know, it's a precious capability. And then on the spectrum of human experience, to varying degrees, we have access to the Dharma. So the kind of the confluence between precious human birth and privilege on a sociological kind of spectrum, you know, like, so how does that, for example, sorry to go off on a tangent, but in Hinduism, there's classes of people, and some of them are untouchables because they have poor birth, you know? So those people may not have access to the same resources as the people from high birth, okay? So how do we reconcile a sociological spectrum of class and power within the system of karma and rebirth to where we're dealing with now two different spectrums, right? Whereas we have precious human birth to the extent we're here in this center and able to understand the Dharma and listen to it, right? But where does that intersect with our sociological privilege? And how do we even talk about that?
Well, we are, or you are anyway. It's a, you know, that is a much more profound question than we ordinarily give it credibility for, give it credit for. I think in a certain sense, I think they intersect just because everything in our culture intersects with everything in our culture, whether we notice it or not. Those are the things that are going on. So my first thought on that is that the separation that you're creating there is actually a conceptual separation. I'm not sure that it's an experiential one. And the experiential one is the one that counts, of course, more than anything else. So we all witness, I think we're all fairly aware of the fact that we do not all have equal opportunities, whether we're Hindus or Americans or anything else. There's prejudice of all variety that takes place. And in one way, that is just the way the world is. So we could, I'm stretching into my own thought on this, is that we could conceivably imagine that all of those prejudices could be ironed out. Some of them have been to some degree, and others haven't. They've gone deeper and so on. But the question that we might come back to, and the reason this comes to mind to me is because I remember Kala Rinpoche having a question put to him early on, right, like in the month that I met him. He was giving a teaching, and this issue came up. And because of who he was, he pretty much completely ignored the question. It's like, and he basically took all of the cultural things, which I think he would agree are not so helpful, not so good, and all, but he took it all under kind of the one heading of, this is the nature of confusion. It's like you cannot beat it in the ordinary ways that you bring about change and all. Because we're confused, we tend to continually manifest more confusion in various ways. I remember at the time, and he was talking about precious human birth at that time also, going through the classic contemplations, the most important one being in the beginning, precious human birth. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, why is human birth particularly precious? And while I'm thinking of that, he's explaining what it is. And by the time he gets done explaining, I realized I wasn't listening to what he said. So I remember that evening like so well. I had no relationship to precious human birth at all. It was more in the category of, hey, you're born a human? Cool. You're not? That's okay. But in the context of, see, my mind is thinking of it in terms of my life, which has a discrete beginning and a discrete end, and everything is kind of packaged nicely. He's talking about there's no such boundary. No such boundary. So you discover while you're living that you're living. And then it's helpful if you can discover that, actually my circumstances are pretty good. Not the best, but I can certainly imagine a worse circumstance. And then my brain goes to, so what? Why do I care? And I think, even looking back at that, that was a very good question. Why do I care about that? And at this point, I would say, I care about it because I hold the view that my experience, not my existence, let's put that word aside kind of because it's a little bit muddy, but my experience, kind of the stream of experience, has no boundary, which is to say it has no beginning and it has no end. And of course, our minds can easily go first to, it has a beginning, I'm born and all of that. But no, actually we say, why not hold the view that it has no beginning? Your experience does not begin with your birth. It doesn't even begin with your conception. It actually begins before this life. And so all of the interconnected pieces that we have in the previous life becomes part of the interconnected pieces in this life. I pondered that for at least a decade before it just very gradually became relevant. For a very long time, it just seemed, it's not so much that it seemed irrelevant, I just couldn't find a way to make it relevant. So many other things were important. The movie that's playing down the street, with whatever it is, I just met a new girlfriend, and so that seemed really important. And the precious human birth, yeah, it's pretty good this today, it's just, it was not really where we want it to be, which is, if you look at it from an unbounded perspective, not because that's true that it's unbounded, but rather it's an issue of, what about looking at my life through a lens of no boundaries, no beginning and no end? And yet, along with no beginning and no end, Every last thing that I've ever said, ever done, ever thought is part of the chain, the causal chain of things unfolding. My likes and dislikes didn't start in this life, though we all think they do. I just today realized, I really like algebra. I think I'll go take an algebra class or whatever it is. But what if we looked at all of that through the lens of there isn't any beginning? There isn't any beginning and there isn't any end. There's no side, there's no top, there's no bottom, and yet the interconnected, interdependent pieces of experience in it are completely manifest. That, I thought, was a wake-up. Not because it's true. I've always had a problem with the truth of these things. But there's pieces that are easy to hold as a lens through which you can look at something. And the unbounded view of your own flow of experience is a great lens to look through. Experientially.
Thank you. Yes, that's very helpful. Because that question comes out of a very critical mind, But if I look at it experientially, and if I look really closely, when I do practices like looking at somebody else's suffering, and comparing myself to them, or putting myself, sending and taking, and those kind of experiential practices, the question that I asked from that critical mind starts to fall apart. Can
you say more about that?
So the mind that I guess I can only speak for myself, is that the mind that asks a question about sociological circumstances and how privilege works and how all of those parameters fall within the Dharma, that question comes from a mind that's very critical, very analytical, very reasoning, and very, puts things in categories and tries to kind of control all those things, So that question comes from that place. Okay, but when I start to do certain practices like sending and taking, for example, for me, that comes from a different mind. That comes from a mind that's not conceptual. It comes from a mind that is more experiential, like you're talking about. What would it be like to actually experience the suffering of somebody who's in a different circumstance than me? What would that actually feel like and be like? That kind of thing, for me, starts to, the question then of how privilege works and everything, it kind of starts to break apart. And it's more about relating to the person who's in that other circumstance. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yeah.
I listened to a podcast twice.
Say that again, sorry.
I listened to a podcast twice because I was trying to figure out what this was talking about. It was with Angel Kyoto Williams. She is an African-American Zen Buddhist priest. And the part I had to listen to twice, partially because I was in a plane and half asleep, and then I just realized I missed something, so I needed to listen to it again when I was not on a plane, half asleep. And she didn't give a concrete example, which I would have loved to have heard in this podcast, but it was about privilege. And when we use the word privilege, maybe especially in an environment like this, we're kind of inherently recognizing our sociological position of power, and that her twist, if I understand it correctly, is that when we are thinking of the suffering of others due to their lesser socioeconomic status, that we also have to figure out how their suffering is causing our own suffering in a very tangible way, instead of saying, I'm relatively better off than the other person. It was to try to find how their suffering is connected to our own. So it was just, I wish you would have given some examples of how that kind of translates, but I thought that was very a challenging way of looking at that.
Virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Thank you all for your contributions this evening. And of course, we'll continue for at least 3 or 4 lifetimes.